We're going to be looking at least the subject matter, is staying the plague. Coming out of Numbers chapter 25, verses 6 through 9, we'll get to in just a bit. We're going to look at a man that's really not very well known, at least not by a lot of Christians, surprisingly. But if I were to tell you about a particular story that involved him and how that he, it says, made atonement for Israel's sin and stopped a plague that had killed 24,000 people, you might remember a little bit more about him. What he did is so significant that God ended up promising his family with the priesthood, that it would never leave his family. And that's really significant when you consider how he came to be the high priest himself. Now, I've preached on this passage and this study before when I dealt with the covenant of redemption and dealing with the type of redemption, the type of covenant with this particular man. That was a long series, but basically looking at dispensations in the covenants. And it's a rich study. But I want to do three things we're going to look at. The fellow that I'm talking about is Phinehas. Most of you might already have known who I was talking about. And we're going to do three things associating three words. We're going to talk about finding Phinehas. In other words, we're going to try to discover who he is. We're going to follow Phinehas. By that, we're going to discover what he did. And then lastly, we're going to be figuring Phinehas. Now, I might not get really to that point too much, but the idea of discovering, figuring, how, what did he do that God blessed him so tremendously? And what do we get out of that? We'll discover some of it. We're going to begin by reading out of Numbers 25. So if you have your own scriptures, hopefully you can follow along with me as we go through this. And we'll begin reading. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel in the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. Just looking again at kind of finding Phinehas. Who was he? Well, we find out he was the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the grandson of Aaron, the grandnephew of Moses. He's a Levite. He's of the priest of the Aaronic order. What we learn right off the bat real easily is you can find that coming through Moses and Aaron, or literally through Aaron, Aaron and Moses were both born to Amram and Jochebed. You find that in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 20. Number two, we find that Aaron married Elisheba, and they had 4 sons, and they're given in their birth order. And if you follow along, firstborn will always get a double portion. The firstborn, in particular, of the high priest would be the next in line for the high priest. And so you can see they had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. You find that in Exodus 6 and 23. And then we learn that Eleazar married a daughter of Putiel and bare him Phinehas. So that's where we're going to go. But if you notice the whole subject there, or the lineage, it's interesting that you'll notice that Eleazar is not firstborn. So something's got to transpire here to get Eleazar in line. It's also interesting to note that Moses did not give his family tree. We never do read about that. We don't read about his sons coming in place of him and as head of the civil government like Aaron's did with the ecclesiastical leadership. Nadab, as you see in line there, was the firstborn of Aaron and would be next in line for the office of the high priest. So something has to happen to Nadab and Abihu for Eleazar to be the high priest, for then Phinehas to be the next in line after Eleazar. And what do we learn? Well, both Nadab and Abihu were killed because of something they did. Nadab, in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer and put fire therein. Notice that. They put fire therein and put incense thereon and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. It is said that that strange fire was so called because it was not the fire that fell from heaven and had consumed the sacrifice of the burnt offering and the fat that was offered by Aaron in the previous chapter. In fact, if you look at Leviticus 9 and 24, there came a fire out from before the Lord and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. That fire was there in the altar. They should have taken that fire from the altar, but apparently they did not. Instead of taking the fire from this altar, they took their own fire or a different fire or a common fire. In other words, the fire did not come from the altar, did not come from heaven. So now in their death, Eleazar now becomes the next in line for the position of high priest. And thus Phinehas comes also into that line. And we read in 1 Chronicles 9 and 20, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was the ruler over them in time past, and the Lord was with him. You'll see that again a little bit later. And I think it's something great to note that it says the Lord was with him. And you're going to see as we go through when we start following him how much the Lord was with him. And boy, did he need it with some of the circumstances and situation that he was in. The offering that Aaron had offered of the burnt offering was accepted by God and designated such by the fire falling from heaven and consuming the sacrifice. But here's another fire coming from God, which shows they were not accepted. Their offering and their work was not accepted by God. They set aside the order and the origin of the fire from the altar, creating their own fire, and God's response was quick and severe. The whole process, though, of this is very new, but it's very clear that God is also establishing in the newness of this that no missteps will be tolerated, especially none by the priest. Here it's also interesting to note that Aaron, and these are his two oldest sons, no mourning would be allowed. In fact, in chapter 10, verse 3, I won't show you that, but Aaron, it says, held his peace, and Moses gave orders to have their bodies carried outside the camp by family. Moses also ordered Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar not to uncover their heads. In other words, they had their priestly bonnets that were on their head, and they were not supposed to remove them. They were not to remove or rend their clothes. He says, lest you die. They were not to mourn for these two boys that were killed, or these two men. They were to remain in the tabernacle because they had already been sanctified, so they could not even touch their brothers' bodies unless they too become unclean. So the strict standard of sanctification and God's justice without mourning would leave a very strong impression, I think, on Phinehas in the death of his older brothers. Phinehas seems to be part of the top guards of the tabernacle and of the camp. In other words, the Levites were given the orders to care for and guard the entryway of the camp and the entry into the tabernacle. And I think this situation moved Phinehas a great deal. And this too, if you remember, something drastic is going to happen. And that's what I think moves him to act when he saw the plague of God falling upon Israel, when he saw the sin at Shittim and the judgment of God. Phinehas is noted in several different instances where God's severe judgment and justice fell upon Israel. Now, we don't see necessarily Phinehas act in all of those three events, but he's there. So I want to follow Phinehas when we begin to look. Number one, the first is the story at Moab, and we'll learn a little bit about that. Story number two is the sin at Midian. Story number three is the sin at Jordan. And story number four is the sin at Gibeah. So if we're following Phinehas, we learned where he's come from, what his genealogy is. But we also see how he became in the lineage of the high priest. And that, I think, again, makes a big impact on him. When we talk about the sin at Moab, we're talking there about Israel, the Moabites, Baal Peor, and the Midianites. In this particular case, it's sad to say that the enemy got the upper hand of Israel, even though no arrow was ever shot, no spear was ever raised, and no battle was really ever fought against Israel hand to hand, but they beat Israel nonetheless. How did they do that? Well, the daughters of Moab, that's the daughters of Midian, were used to seduce the leaders, the men of Israel. They did that through fleshly delights and then used their sorceries and their wicked and obscene worship of false god Baal Peor. How did they know how to do all this? Well, Balaam, if you remember, Balaam couldn't curse Israel, but he knew how to get to Israel and their weak point, and he taught them how to seduce Israel. He basically told them, you have to make Israel sin to get them to lose the battle. And basically he's teaching them, if you can do that, they'll defeat themselves. Kind of sounds like Christians, doesn't it? Otherwise, God fights for them. He even told them, God will empower the earth, the sun, the moon, the wind, and the rain, and even insects to fight for Israel. But if you get them to disobey God's commands, and the Lord will fight against Israel. God will curse Israel for their sins, and then make them eat of the fruit of their own sins. All of that because God too had said to Israel, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not bow down to another god. But they did. That's what happened with these Midianite women. They did serve another god, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and a plague broke out among them and killed 24,000 people. God calls for the heads of those who had joined themselves to Baal Peor. That you can see and read that the fierce anger of the Lord might be turned away. That's why he called for their heads. So people were dying as a result of their disobedience. The Lord told them he was a jealous God, and he told them that what would happen if they disobeyed the command to worship him and him only. Basically, he says, obey and be blessed, or disobey and be cursed, vexed, and die from the plague. The Levites, we learn, are there and were there to protect Israel from the wrath of God. In Numbers chapter 1 and verse 53, it says, but the Levite shall pitch round about the tabernacle of testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel, and the Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of testimony. They were to hold people back. That was to protect them. They were to control their entry so that they would not be harmed. God gave Israel a provision, too, to deal with their sin. In Numbers chapter 8, verses 18 and 19, it says, "And I have taken the Levites for all the firstborn of the children of Israel, and I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and to his sons from among the children of Israel to do the service of the children of Israel in the tabernacle of the congregation." Notice this, "and to make an atonement for the children of Israel, and that there be no plague among the children of Israel when the children of Israel come nigh into the sanctuary." In other words, their sins could bring plagues, and the Levites were to atone for the sins of Israel to stop or prevent the plagues when they had sinned. If you remember, when Israel lusted after the meat and foods of Egypt, they complained about the provisions of God, and a plague of fire fell, and it talks about at least 23,000 died on that day. The 10 spies that gave a bad report caused them to die by a plague immediately, and for the rest of the tribe, everybody 20 and over to die. In the rebellion of Korah, 14,700 died before the plague was stayed by Aaron's censer among the camp, while those leaders of the rebellion, if you remember, were swallowed by the earth. The high priest, it says, stood between the dead and the living. Now, in this particular case that we were looking at, there was a wicked man that during this time, he found no problem expressing his sin without shame in front of the entire congregation of Israel and directly in the sight of Moses and Aaron. As the people are grieving, sad to see this plague traveling through Israel, Phinehas acts without fear and without shame. While the people are dying and crying and weeping, one man stands up and takes action. What a somber picture. Sorrow, death, destruction, and there's only one man that stayed the plague. That is a picture of Christ, isn't it? Seems to me. All because Israel had chosen to sin openly. And people will say, well, you mean this one guy's act? Well, remember when they went into with Joshua and they took Jericho, and God said, don't touch anything there. It all belongs to him. One man took some stuff, just one. But in the very next battle, Israel lost, 30,000 men? So it only takes one. So when we begin to look at this, this man unashamed has no fear of God in his eyes, and even though God had said, take these men out and hang them, it's the grandson of the high priest. He's a Levite. He stood up or rose up, took that javelin in his hand, went right into the tent, and can you imagine, he thrust them both through to the ground. But it was that particular act, God said, stop the plague that was decimating the people of Israel. The sin was destroying them, and the sin had to be stopped and wiped out. Phinehas took matters into his own hands as an appointed, cleansed, and consecrated priest. He administered the justice of God and ended the wrath of God. The plague was stopped, and the death toll ceased to rise. Now that's the story of Phinehas in the first. But then, after again we see Moses sent them away to the war, 1,000 of every tribe. I should say this is the sin of Midian. At Midian, Phinehas is going to go to war with them, and Moses sent them to war, 1,000 of every tribe, them and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, to war with the holy instruments and the trumpets to blow in his hand. So we can see he's acting as the high priest, or acting as the priest going to war, and going to war with the probably the ark, or at minimum at least the trumpets. and they warred against the Midianites as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males. So they were supposed to do this. Some say that he, like I said, he went with the ark. Others say it was just the ephod, silver trumpets. We don't know. It just says the holy instruments and the trumpets to blow in his hand. But we know that he was at both. Again, the locations. He was at the sin of Moab. He was at the sin of Midian. And now we're going to look at him being at the sin at Jordan. Well, what happened at Jordan? In Joshua chapter 22, we read about the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And if you remember, they decided they wanted to stay on the other side of the Jordan. And without consulting anyone else, they ended up building a great altar on the wrong side of the Jordan River. So let me just show you in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 10. Well, we already read that one. Guess I doubled up some slides there. There we go. And when they came unto the borders of Jordan that are in the land of Canaan, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by Jordan, a great altar to see to. The other tribes ended up hearing about this, and they gathered war against them at Shiloh. And they sent Phinehas and 10 princes of the tribes, and they asked about this trespass. It may have been, in fact, Phinehas that was the spokesman and reminded them of the sin of Israel in the plains of Moab, which he was there. And he asked, I think it was him that asked if that was so small a sin that you needed to add to it by doing this, by building this. The plague there had ended, 24,000 dead, but the shame, he said, of that sin continues to this day. So he says, pay attention, what are you doing? They explained, of course, their reasoning for building the altar was not to rebel against God. They said the reason that they built the altar was to remind our children of our connection with you on the other side of the Jordan, and to remind your children, if they came over here, that we were connected with this altar. It's strictly built as a memorial, that we are all family and we worship the same God. So it was an altar of witness, not an altar to be worshiped at. Phinehas was the spokesman, and it says that in Joshua 22 and 30 that this saying pleased them. They then brought word back to Israel, and they reversed their orders to go to war. But Phinehas was there. Then once we look a little bit further, the sin of Moab, the sin of Midian, then the sin of Jordan, and then the sin at Gibeah. This is kind of a horrible one. In the days of Judges, you might remember that every man did that which was right in their own eyes. A Levite had taken a trip, and he was actually in Judges 19, you can read this, and he was in Gibeah. Along the way, he had refused several homes to stay at and spend the night along the way. But once he got to Gibeah, an old man takes him in, and while there's some of the city, the Bible calls them sons of Belial, demanded that the man be brought out to them that they might abuse him sexually. Instead, the concubine was given to them, and they abused her all night to where before the morning came up, she had been released but came up to the door and died at the doorstep. Sadly, that Levite cut her into 12 pieces and fed extra to all of the 12 tribes. I do that a little lighthearted, but he did cut her up in 12 pieces, and he sent one piece to each one of the tribes. So Israel responded and gathered for war. They asked for the guilty parties, but the tribe of Benjamin would not turn them over. 2 battles will take place. In the first battle, Israel lost and ended up retreating. But before they go out again, they ask God if they should go out and fight against them. Well, let's read some of that in Judges 20, verses 26 through 28. It says, Then all the children of Israel and all the people went up and came up unto the house of God and wept and sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the children of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And guess who shows up here in the verse 28? And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days. So that tells you he's the high priest, saying, Shall I yet go again out to battle against the children of Benjamin, my brother? Again, see, this is why they had already battled once, but lost. Benjamin, my brother, shall I cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into thine hand. They devised a plan to draw the men of Gibeon away from the city, and it worked. About 10,000 special forces struck Gibeah, and it says in, I don't have that verse, wonder why. Judges 20 and 35, it says, And the Lord smote Benjamin before Israel, and the children of Israel destroyed of the Benjamins that day 25,100 men. All these drew the sword. Much more of the battle, of course, is written about. It's a very sad encounter, especially for the tribe of Benjamin, but for all of Israel. In all of this, you can see in finding Phinehas how he became the high priest. In following him, and when we see him first in that battle at Moab, or when he was staying, the plague that was killing, when he struck through both the man and the woman that were committing adultery right there in front of the congregation, it says that he made atonement for Israel for that particular sin, and he stopped the plague. It was because of that that God promised him that of his family the priesthood would never leave. And in fact, Christ is that one, the high priest that would never leave. One of the things, without getting, because I don't have enough time in figuring Phinehas, I'm just going to deal with this a little bit, that again, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. You and I are priests today because of Christ and because of what he did. The divine notice of Phinehas and how that he turned away God's wrath because he was zealous for God's sake and for God's glory. God promised to keep the priesthood within his family at all times. That doesn't mean that every one of them would be righteous men, because it was done on the part or because of Phinehas. God gave him a covenant of peace. And the only covenant of peace that I've ever found in the scriptures is the atonement made by Jesus Christ. That's why, to me, there's a parallel between this particular covenant that was made with Phinehas and the eternal covenant that's made with Christ and with us as priests. Phinehas saw that covenant of peace. He understood, he believed God, just like Abraham, just like his great uncle, and just like his father Eleazar. The terms are very clear. They are also, when you see the promise that God gave him, they are unconditional, and they depend upon the power of God to fulfill them. They do not depend upon Eleazar, they do not depend upon Aaron, and they certainly do not even depend upon Phinehas. They depend upon God. This was to be an everlasting priesthood for he and his sons after him, regardless of their behavior. It was because of his actions. He made atonement for the sins of Israel and stopped the plague of the wrath of God that day. Well, Phinehas is a type of Christ. Jesus is our everlasting great high priest. Phinehas was promised life, and that was God's plan and purpose that could not fail. he must remain alive. That means that he could not be killed. He had to remain alive. He had to have children, and his children had to remain alive for them to be able to be in that high priest. The covenant could not be broken. It could not be disannulled. His genealogy is listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, and 12 generations later, his seed executed the office of the priest, during the time of Solomon. He's mentioned one other time in Psalm, matter of fact, with having to do with the Moabites, the Midianites. Never did Israel want for a man to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord because of this man. Phinehas' name was mentioned above all other names because of what he did. Jesus Christ's name is above all other names because of what he did and who he was. The enemy was always trying to ruin Israel. It's interesting how often Phinehas, in those particular events, those stories, he was there during some awful sins of Israel. Well, guess who's there for us if we ever sin? Jesus Christ is our great high priest. The enemy is set to seduce and destroy us, and he will do it despite how strong we may be if we depend upon our own strength. He will use our own weaknesses against us. But we need to remember that Christ has set us free from that sin. He has saved us from the wrath of God, and he has saved us from the power of sin. And we need to stand in that same covenant, stand firmly and strongly, depending not upon our strength, not upon our covenant, but on the grace and mercy and unconditional covenant that we find in Jesus Christ. I hope that's been a blessing to you tonight. Just a little bit of a look at staying the plague and really a story about Phinehas, the son